All right, I've just
This
turned
means
the
being-
recording. I am now going to
Nope, no
mute
sound.
everybody, so just give me a moment and I will mute you all.
Let me do it. You don't know how to do it. Let me
All
do it
right.
with my.
Mute all, yes. All right. All right, effectively, I have now muted all of you. And hopefully Mike and Marlene will find their way on at some point along the way. Couple of things as we begin. First of all, you should have received yesterday night or this morning a supplementary reading. If you didn't get to it, don't worry. We will have a chance to talk about it. We may not get to it today. I sent it out at the last minute. It is a Rabbi Sachs reading, but not the one that you have in your book. It was one that I chose that I thought would be appropriate. Let's see, is there anything else I want to tell everybody? I think that's it. You will not necessarily need your Humashim today. The material that we're going to study together, we will put on the screen so that everybody can follow that on the screen as we go through it. Today we are coming to arguably one of the most spectacular phenomenon stories that is found in the entire books of the Torah. One would be hard pressed to come up with a more remarkable account. I do not say miraculous or supernatural, because those of you who have read Rabbi Sachs's reading know that just like the other first 9 plagues in the Torah can be explained in naturalistic terms, it is possible to explain the crossing of the Red Sea without having to resort to miracles. So I will not call it one of the most miraculous events of the Torah. It is not. But it is certainly the most spectacular, which is probably why the film director Cecil B. DeMille made it the climax of his film, The 10 Commandments. If you want to end with a dramatic scene, have Charlton Heston lift up his staff and have the waters of the Red Sea divide and the children of Israel pass through in safety. You then combine the climactic moment in the story of the Exodus with a great point in the film on which to end. The story is a remarkable story. It tells how arguably 2.5 to 3 million people who had just recently been redeemed from Egypt stood on the bank of a Red Sea anticipating destruction. Suddenly, at the last moment, they were all miraculously saved, redeemed. Their enemy, who they thought was going to take them and either annihilate them or bring them back in chains to Egypt, suddenly disappears forever. And then begins the story of the march toward Sinai and the march toward freedom. It is an event that we recall in the synagogue and in our homes every single day. Those of you who are regular synagogue goers know that in every morning service, in every service in the morning, between the preliminary service, what we call Birchot HaShachar and Pesukei de Zimra, we read the story complete of the crossing of the Red Sea. It is featured in every morning service, weekday or Shabbat. If that were not enough, we are also told every evening and every morning, in each of the services, after we read the Shema before we start the Amidah, a small encapsulated version of the crossing of the Red Sea is recounted in the blessing, in which we actually sing the song that Moses and the Jewish people sang as they were redeemed, Mi chamocha ba'elim Adonai. If that were not enough, in the 3rd paragraph of the Shema itself, we make reference to God who took us out of Egypt. So this is a big deal. This is an event that really matters. When an event is mentioned every day in Jewish life, Sabbath and regular day, 2 or 3 or more times per day, you know you are dealing with a major event. I don't think there is any other biblical event that is mentioned in our services as frequently as the crossing of the Red Sea. It may be the most frequent event that we recount on a day-to-day basis. It is engraved in our memory. It is the supreme event, the climax, as it were, in the story of the Exodus. And therefore, I hope you all had a chance to read it, but in case you didn't, we are now going to share it. We're going to take a look at that event as well. So let me get the share screen. And now I am going to put up the material. And if the material looks familiar to you, it should, because it is the material from last week's Torah portion. I'm not going backward, I'm just going ahead a little bit. Before I start, thumbs everybody, or fingers or something. Can you all see what I have here? I only see about 6 or 7 of you, but if you all raise your thumbs, I'm going to assume that you can all see it. All right. Well, so here we go. It is chapter 17. I know you've all read it. You're all good students, but you'll forgive me if I very quickly go through it. It's not that long a passage. Let me go through it with you quickly one last time. All right, so it's chapter 17. Let's see, is it 17? Oh, I'm sorry, I don't know why we have 17 up here. It's not chapter 17.
Have to scroll down.
I have to scroll up. Hold on a second, I'm scrolling up here. It's not even in the right portion. All right, well, sorry about that. I thought I had the right one.
You said it was the same one as last time.
It was, but this isn't, this Shalach isn't it.
What
hold
is
on,
it?
everybody.
What is it? What's it? What
It's
is
in
it?
Exodus. I don't know how
Why are we in Deuteronomy?
I don't know why I got to Deuteronomy. Everybody patient for a moment. If I don't have it, I will just
Tell me
skip
where to
that.
go.
It's left over from Samuel last week.
Exodus chapter, let's see, what chapter is it? Try chapter 13 or 14. Okay, let's go down now. Down, 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 down. Sorry, everybody. Here we are.
Okay, I have to do this first.
Hold on a moment.
I have to reshare it.
All right, we're experiencing brief technical difficulties. All right. Okay, does everybody now see it there? This is the correct text. Sorry, for some reason we were sharing the text from from Samuel, our text from last week. All right. All right, so I'm going to start from verse number 5. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his courtiers had a change of heart about the people, and they said, "What is this we have done, releasing Israel from our service?" So no sooner did the people leave, after a day or two, that Pharaoh and his court has a change of heart. What have we done? Why have we let our slaves go? Pharaoh ordered his chariots and took his men with him. He took 600 of his picked chariots and the rest of the chariots of Egypt with officers in all of them. The Lord stiffened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he gave chase to the Israelites. As the Israelites were departing defiantly, the Egyptians gave chase to them, and all the horsemen and chariots of Pharaoh overtook them and camped by the sea near Pi Hachirot and Baal Zephon. As Pharaoh drew near, the Israelites caught sight of the Egyptians advancing upon them. Greatly afraid, the Israelites cried out to the Lord, and they said to Moses, "Was it because of a lack of graves in the land of Egypt that you brought us out to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us, taking us out of Egypt? Is this not the very thing we told you while we were still in Egypt, saying, 'Let us be, and let us serve the Egyptians, for it is better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness?' But Moses said to the people, 'Have no fear. Stand by and witness the deliverance which the Lord will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see this day, you will never see again. The Lord will battle for you, and you shall be silent. You shall hold your peace.' Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Why do you cry out to me? Tell the Israelites to go forward.'" And then we have the instructions. God says to Moses, "Lift up your rod, hold your arm over the sea and split it, so that the Israelites might march to the sea on dry ground. And that is the end of the shared text. I'm coming back now. We'll all come back together. All right. Everybody, you're familiar with the text now. All right. You have the text. You have seen what the text says as the introduction to the crossing of the Red Sea. So I have a series of questions for you now. And for the next period of 15, 20 minutes, you'll do most of the talking and I'll listen. Okay, this is the question I have for you. I call this unit the Lessons of the Sea, the Reed Sea. And by the way, I'm going to use interchangeably the terms Reed Sea or Red Sea. Correctly speaking, the sea is known as Yam Suf in Hebrew, which means the Sea of Reeds or the Reed Sea. Why it is called the Red Sea, I do not know. It may just be a it may have meant to be the Reed Sea and people just read it as Red Sea. Some people have attempted to explain why it was called the Red Sea. Today, of course, we know this body of water as the Red Sea, but in Hebrew, it was always called Yam Suf, the Sea of Reeds or the Reed Sea. So it's the same sea, whatever I call it, this is the sea that we are talking about. And we have already seen in maps where that is located, dividing Egypt proper from the Sinai Peninsula. On one side of the Sea of Reeds is slavery in Egypt. On the other side of the Sea of Reeds, you have the Sinai Peninsula and the road to freedom. So the sea is the boundary line. All right. My question to you is this, and may seem like a silly question, and you can answer me in a silly way if you want. I'll accept that if you would like. But the question is this: why is this episode here? Why do we need this episode? Think about it for a second. The whole point of the story of the Exodus was that God wants Pharaoh to release God's people so that they can serve God. Pharaoh refuses. In a series of 10 tests, God breaks the will of Pharaoh and proves before the eyes of Pharaoh and Egypt and Israel that there is no force in the universe that can resist him. Finally, on the night of the 10th, the final plague, Pharaoh gives in. He acquiesces to God's demand and he allows Moses and the Hebrew slaves to leave. They leave, they go out. Not only do they go out, they go to their neighbors. They have already borrowed and taken from them all kinds of valuable merchandise. They leave Egypt and they are gone. The story could have ended there. The point is, if the point of the plagues was to convince Pharaoh to let the Jewish people leave, there's no need for this appendix or this epilogue. What is the story doing here? Why is the story here? Why couldn't we have just ended the story with the Jewish people leaving Egypt, somehow or other making it into the Sinai desert and continuing their journey? What is this episode here to do? I assume there's a lesson to be learned. That's why I called it the lesson of the sea. But what's the lesson that we're supposed to learn from it? Now, this is not easy. It's going to take us the rest of this session to figure this one out. It is a very complicated answer. Jerry, I see your hand, so you may begin.
Well, first I would like to reply kind of flippantly and then maybe seriously. So apparently Pharaoh hadn't got his water wings yet. He had learned to swim. But with all seriousness, apparently Pharaoh still hasn't decided this question of, let's say, God versus Pharaoh. Pharaoh's character is that every time the plague happened, he would say, okay, you can go now, but then he changed his mind. So I'm thinking Pharaoh's there in Egypt. He looks around at the palace and the pyramids and the structures. And wait a minute, we Egyptians have created all this history. Everybody knows what we've done. I can't let it end this way. I am Pharaoh. And who is this God of the Israelites that should oppose me? And that would be my opinion.
All right. So what Jerry is saying is it's necessary for the character development of Pharaoh. We know a thing or two about Pharaoh. Pharaoh is a guy who acts impetuously. He responds to duress. Whenever Egypt is under serious attack, he says, okay, go, 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 get out. And then when the plague or the problem ends, he says, I changed my mind. Okay, he's like a little kid. Maybe we're just allowing Pharaoh to change his mind again. After all, he had a couple of days. As Jerry puts it, he had a chance to look around and said, whoop, I just let my workforce go. I'm going to have a lot of empty positions, and there are not a lot of people in Egypt who can fulfill those positions. It gives Pharaoh a chance, now not under immediate distress, to change his mind one more time. Had the Jewish people left, Pharaoh could later have said, what did I do? What could I do? I was forced to let them go. Egypt was under attack. We were losing all of our firstborn. By giving Pharaoh a chance to change his mind one more time, Jerry suggests, we are allowing the story to play out. Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, I believe that we are being told in the story, and more importantly, the Jewish people are being told that there's no going back here, that the distraction of the very powerful Pharaoh in Egypt is not anything to be concerned about anymore. Concentrate on what God is trying to teach the Jewish people going forward, and that's why we're being told this particular portion.
Okay, excellent, Mike. What Mike is saying, and then Larry, I'll come to you, Larry Burse. What Mike is saying is, story isn't quite over. The Jewish people have left, and the Egyptians have suffered, but the story hasn't quite finished yet. Pharaoh himself hasn't suffered. Egypt hasn't been punished. There's a little left of the story left unsaid. And so now it is necessary for this last part of the story to take place for us to complete the sequence, to watch what happens now as the story plays itself out. And Mike is right. There is no going to be any going back. Israel will witness the destruction of the major force that is sent out against it. They will see chariots and horsemen and a mighty army destroyed. In a sense, they can't go back anyway, but they will have seen the destruction of a large force of their enemy. It represents the end of the Egyptian period. So maybe we needed to see this, and maybe the Israelites needed to see this in order to realize that Egypt was no longer coming after them. Pharaoh let us out. For whatever reason, he let us out. But when they see their enemy defeated, they understand the story, the Egyptian part of the story is over. Go ahead, Larry Burse.
Well, that God is almighty, and he will continue to watch over the people of Israel.
All right. So the story doesn't end with the story of Egypt. God is almighty. He's not just the God who's going to take the Jewish people out of Egypt. He's going to be the God who watches their passage from slavery to freedom and is there to protect them. Joseph, go ahead.
Oh, so I'm going to build on Larry's point and then make another point.
Okay.
So not only it allows the Jews who are complaining and still questioning, even though they saw all those plagues, they're still questioning. This gives them the final confidence that they can do anything, that God will be with them, and they can go anywhere and do anything with God's help. The second point I want to make is, I told this story in class, one of our first discussions back in, maybe it was Judges, when we first started, that as a kid, we would play the game called Risk, where you would battle and try to control the world. It was a board game. And people, the kids, each of us little kids, 10, 11 years old, would pick a different general. And I said, I want to be Moses and command the army of Hebrew slaves. And the other kids refused to play that day if I was going to do that, because nothing could withstand God and Moses and the Hebrew army. So in a way, just like Cecil B. DeMille, I think God wanted this big event that would be told from now to eternity, where even kids in the 20th century at 10 years old would know this story inside and out and be afraid and know God's power. Basically, I think it was a message for the whole world and every generation of the world from time to come about God's power and God's love for the Jewish people.
You put it beautifully, Joseph. What a powerful coda finale to the story. By the way, I admire your humility. You could have asked to be God and played the story of Risk. If you'd been God, that would have been it would have displayed a little hubris, but God is better than Moses when it comes to this battle. All right. Good. Anybody else? You're all right. Cantor? Cantor, Ray.
Look, doesn't the Torah tell us why this was the way it was? Say yes, and I'll read it to you.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, well,
Okay.
go ahead and you read it,
It
Cantor. That's
says,
fine.
it says, Pharaoh will save the Israelites. Their straight in the wilderness is closed in on them. I may gain glory through Pharaoh and all his host, and the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord. So it's not a big mystery why this happened. God said this is what he was going to do. This is exactly what God planned. Pharaoh didn't change his mind. The last we heard from Pharaoh was he said to Moses, take your people, get out of here, and put in a good word for me with your God.
Mhm.
So the idea that Pharaoh changed his mind is a little bit naive, because it says in the text, God hardened Pharaoh's heart, just like he did during all the plagues.
True, but this is consistent with Pharaoh's character. I'm not going to take away agency from Pharaoh. Pharaoh changed his mind again, consistent with what he's done all the way along the way. But I do think your point is well taken. God is going to make a demonstration that this victory is his. Now, I could argue that based on the first 10 plagues, I could tell you that people saw the plagues, they saw that Egypt was suffering, but they didn't necessarily know God was doing it. You know? All right, so the water of the Red Sea turns red and creatures die. All right, so we have some infestations, locusts, frogs, lice, you know. So we have some darkness, we have a sandstorm. That doesn't mean that God, you know, that's happenstance. But when you have an Egyptian army going into the Red Sea to chase Israelite slaves, and you have a sea divide and the Israelite slaves walk through the water, and then as the Egyptian army enters in and is swallowed up in the water, that's a pretty dramatic demonstration that God is fighting, all right? By the way, if you missed the point of the first 10 plagues, we're going to emphasize that God is doing this. The miracle of the crossing of the Red Sea is clearly a sign that God is triumphing over Egypt. It is a sign to Egypt, it is a sign to Israel. And Cantor did not quote another verse, but there's another verse that says God does this to prove not only to Pharaoh and to Egypt and Joseph, to all of us in later generations of his might, he does this to prove the truth of Moses as a leader so that all Israel will come to respect and fear him. So he needed this great drama. This last act was necessary in order to confirm that it was not happenstance, it was not coincidence, it was God himself who was defeating the armies of Egypt in this great, spectacular, dramatic last event, which caused all of Egypt and all of Israel and all of the future generations to believe in God and to believe that Moses was his prophet and Israel was his people. So much so, someone mentioned the book of Joshua, that when the Jews 40 years later enter the land of Canaan, they're still talking about the miracle from 40 years ago about when God defeated the Egyptians, and the people are afraid to touch the Israelites because they got a God who fights for them. This is a big deal. It required this last dramatic act. Had the Israelites gone out, and had there been no last scene at the dividing of the waters of the Red Sea, the story would have been incomplete. And it would have been incomplete for another reason as well. You've all analyzed the story, and I think you've done an excellent job in explaining why this final great event had to take place. But there is a psychological reason it had to take place too. And that has to do with a different question that I'm now going to ask you, and I'm going to let you respond to that, and then I'm going to tie the two questions together. The entire purpose of the story of the Exodus from Egypt is to demonstrate to Egypt, to the world, to the Jewish people, that God is in control, that God has the power to redeem, to bring his people to safety. I want to ask you this question. From the point of the Jewish people, when did the Jewish people feel that they were finally redeemed? Up until this point in our story, what was the moment when the Jewish people finally felt redeemed? From the first appearance of Moses until the crossing of the Red Sea, when did the people say, we made it? God did it. He did what he promised. Anybody want to take that one on? What was the moment of redemption? Can't be wrong here. Go ahead, Lori.
I think, it's not enough to hear about an event, but to actually witness it and have it be evidenced, solid evidence that it's happening. And I guess when the Egyptians were drowned and realized they were not coming back, I think was proof enough for them to realize that there was something more happening than just a miracle.
Excellent, Lori. Excellent. All right. At what moment do you finally realize it's over? It happened. It's done. Arguably, the plagues, they saw the plagues were affecting the Egyptians, but every time Pharaoh was ready to let them go, he changed his mind back and forth, back and forth. You might have thought the last plague, finally, we're marching, we're going, it's over, it's done. That's it. We're all through. They hadn't really witnessed any great acts. The Israelites didn't even see many of the plagues because they were living in a certain area. They weren't affected by the plagues. The first real plague they saw, well, they didn't even see it. They heard it. They heard the cries of the Egyptians in their houses. They weren't out there. They realized that some great tragedy had befallen the Egyptians, but they didn't see the firstborn dead in the Egyptian houses. They hadn't witnessed that. The first time, as Lori says, they actually saw played out before their eyes how their enemies of 200 years finally paid a dramatic price was there at the Red Sea. I don't know about you, but I love revenge movies. Okay? For me, you give me a good Denzel Washington, The Equalizer, or you give me a Dirty Harry movie or something like that. I like it when justice is done. If I get hooked on a Law and Order and I don't know not only who did it, but I don't know he got punished and he went to jail, the max, I'm not satisfied. I need to know there is justice, right? Once they arrest the correct person, that's not justice. You still have to have a trial. Once the trial is in, okay, so the jury comes back guilty, but that's not justice. I wait to hear what the sentence is. And I not only wait to hear the sentence, I want to see the person, the perpetrator, all crazed and paying psychological remorse and finally having to ask, I want justice. I want to see justice done. And the other problem is, if I'm a slave, all right, so the Egyptians let me go, but Pharaoh changed his mind. Do I have to live the rest of my life in the desert worrying that Pharaoh's going to send an army to get me? I want to see the bodies on the riverbanks. Forgive me. I'm emphasizing. I want to see Egyptian oppressors drowning. I want to see the hubris and the pride of Egypt crushed before the God of Israel. All right? There is a psychological need for those who have been oppressed to see the punishment, the just punishment of their oppressors. And their oppressors have got to pay. Okay? They can't be allowed to get out cheap. They can't sign an armistice and get out without paying. If they brought about calamity to the world, justice demands that they taste of the wages of their sin. They must be seen by the victim to suffer. And the victim must know that the enemy will never reach out to touch them or to hurt them again. That's what I want in my Law and Order. That's what I want in my story of the text here, okay? I want to know that justice is done. Arguably, when the Jews, the people of Israel cross the sea and see the waters close on their mighty oppressors and see the chariots and the horsemen being drawn down into the mud, which causes the Egyptians to die in the midst of the sea, I know psychologically we're not supposed to take any joy in that, but at least there is a measure of justice in watching the oppressor suffer the righteous act, the rightful acts, consequences of their sin. Al, go ahead.
Yeah, it's interesting just winding the tape back and taking Ray's point, et cetera. Would have been a lousy movie without the Red Sea. DeMille could have never made the movie.
No.
And I would add Kill Bill and Inglourious Bastards to those revenge movies.
No, yeah, it would be like Inglourious Bastards and not seeing Hitler mowed to pieces at the end. You know, for those of you who've seen Inglourious Bastards, highly problematic. Quentin Tarantino likes films where you get it all out, you know, the catharsis. So he's got, I was going to say poor Hitler. Hitler cut into ribbons, into pieces. If you've ever seen that dramatic scene where Eli Roth is raking him.
Yeah.
Look, go ahead, Al.
There are so many threads in this portion that we read this week. You know, the Israelites questioning Moses and wanting to go back to Egypt. They're fetching like we've done for millennia, fetch all the time. And they finally, you know, and God did, another point to emphasize what Ray said, the Pharaoh basically said, F you to God and the Israelites, and God said, oh, no, wait a minute, it ain't your place and it's gonna happen. So that happened. But then the Jews weren't believing, and so God had to make sure that they did believe by the acts at the Red Sea, because they were not trusting them. But, and then another point, I mean, this is one of the most fabulous portions to read. The angels wanted to rejoice and sing and dance, and God said, no, you're not. In spite of all of what Pharaoh threw in the face of God, he said, these are my children, do not rejoice. In that respect, I think the Jews did anyways. But this was all very transitory because it didn't take long for them to start fetching again, bitching again, not trusting Moses. And I think one could argue that the even bigger miracle, which is to come, is Mount Sinai and the Ten Commandments.
All right, and I would.
Hal, I got a question for Hal.
Sure, go ahead.
I'm in full belief of everything that we just said. Hal, you just brought up something that's been ruminating in the back of my mind for the entire class. Walk me through what you were just talking about when the angels wanted to rejoice about the destruction of the Egyptians.
Yeah.
And God said no.
Neil, first of all, don't look for this in your Bible. Don't look for this in the Torah. It's not there.
I understand. I'm just trying to figure out. I'm still.
All right.
I still want to take a part of it and be contrarian about it and say, wait a minute, God made the Egyptians too. And, you know, so there's another part of this story, which is they ended up having their own Holocaust.
That's correct. Okay. So I wouldn't, except for the word Holocaust, which I would not use.
I'm sorry, I don't know what else to use.
Well, even if you kill 600 men and you add an equal number of horses, it's not a Holocaust. You got to kill an entire nation to have a Holocaust. Egypt didn't all die in the Red Sea, Neil. It was just a small number. But I'll come back to your question in a second. I'll return to Neil's question, but Laura, you had a question as well?
No, I just had a comment that in the reading, it said that the Egyptians died because their strength was turned into weakness, that they were a very strong army, and their overconfidence of being able to get through became their weakness. They couldn't get through the Red Sea. And then the Israelites, their weakness became their strength.
Very good.
You know, they did not have the chariots and the horses, but they had their faith. And
very good.
That's
all right.
That impressed me. Just
that it's good, Lori. But your portion, the portion that you're referring to, you found in the Sachs reading?
In the Chumash.
No, you found it in the Sachs reading.
No, it was in my big blue book.
You sure?
Not in the Sachs reading. Yeah.
You sure you didn't find it?
Because I was reading that today.
Yeah, the Sachs reading is the one who said that their very strength turned into their weakness.
Then maybe it was.
Yeah, maybe it was that. Here's the trouble with both Hal's Midrash and Laurie's reading of Sachs. They're all wonderful, but they're not in the text. Okay. So let me explain Hal's version first and Neil's response to it, and then Laurie's response to that and her reference to Sachs. All right, gets very complicated. The Torah doesn't tell us anything about angels. Hal is referring to what is called a midrash. A midrash is a story that's told by the rabbis. Cantor Cohen doesn't particularly like the midrashim sometimes, but the midrash is rabbinic stories. So let me tell you the midrash that Hal is referring to, and then God's response, and then Neil's question, which fits into God's response. When the Egyptians go after the Hebrews and they proceed to drown in the midst of the Red Sea, Israel is watching all this. The Jewish people are watching all this. And at the end of the episode, when they see their enemy, the Egyptians, totally destroyed in their last attempt to harm the people, the Jewish people burst into song. This is in the Torah, okay? This part's in the Torah. Moses and the children of Israel sang, Az Yashir Moshe Uvenei Israel. Then sang Moses and the children of Israel. And they begin this, Neil, this beautiful, beautiful praise, song of praise to God for destroying their enemy. Okay, that's what they do. And then when the people finish singing it one time, Miriam proceeds to lead the people in singing it a second time, all right? The Midrash says the following, that when the angels see God's destruction of the Egyptians, the angels begin in heaven to sing too. That in response to the Jews rejoicing that their enemies have been finally visited with their just deserts, the angels begin to sing in heaven. They begin to sing the same song that the Israelites are singing down on earth. And God turns to the angels and he basically says to them, don't sing, don't say anything, stop exulting, stop celebrating this, okay? He doesn't tell the Israelites that, Neil. He tells the angels, stop singing, stop celebrating. The Egyptians are my creations too. It is not fitting for you to sing this song of triumph over their death, but it is fitting for the Jewish people to sing it. Now, what is the difference? Why is it fitting, Neil? And I'm going to let you answer your own question. Why is it appropriate that God allows Israel to sing this great song of redemption when they watch their enemies being destroyed, but he stops the angels in heaven from doing it? What's the justification for that? Why would he allow Israel to celebrate, but not the angels?
I'll get back to you tomorrow. I got to think about it.
No, I'm not going to give you a chance tomorrow. Ask the question. I'm going to push you. What did the Egyptians do to the angels? What harm did Egypt do to the angels?
Nothing.
What right did the angels have to say anything? They never suffered from the Egyptians, did they? They have no reason to be angry at the Egyptians. They have no reason to curse the Egyptians. The Jews have a natural right to rejoice when they see their enemy paying the price, but angels should shut up, right? What God is essentially saying to the angels are, look, this people who suffered at their hands, they can sing. They have a reason to rejoice. But you, my heavenly messengers, you have no right to rejoice because I'm the God of all humanity. The Israelites might rejoice for the moment because they're watching their enemies destroyed, but you angels should not rejoice at any of my creatures that I created rejoicing. God upbraids, he rebukes the angels, but he does not rebuke Israel. Why? Because it is natural for a person who suffers to find, I won't say satisfaction or pleasure.
Solace.
Yeah, in the fall of their enemy. Okay, that is the key.
Okay.
What did the rabbi said that because the rabbis understood something the Torah did not. How, and they were puzzled, Neil, by the very question that puzzled you. Because you asked the question the rabbis asked, which was, if God created everything, created all humanity, how could God allow the Egyptians to die? And the answer is, well, the Egyptians died because with their last breath, they went in to pursue and try once more to harass and to hurt the Jewish people. They brought their destruction upon themselves. Okay? That was how they met their end, because they presumed, even at the end, to try and take and kill or capture or whatever the Israelite people. But what the rabbi said is, while we may have been happy that our enemies were destroyed and we were redeemed, we have to remember as well that they were human beings too. And the reason that that midrash that Hal mentioned is told is to remind the Jewish people later, yes, the Egyptians had to die because they were pursuing you. But in time to come, don't take joy in the death of your enemy. Understand that it happened. The people at the time were allowed to rejoice, but we should remember that unfortunately it took other people dying to win our liberation. Neil, you've been at the Passover Seder, haven't you? I know you have, because you've been at my Passover Seder. And you know there's a point in the Seder where we fill our cups with wine. And then as we mention each of the 10 plagues, what do, Neil? We
Spill a drop.
And
For
we
each plague.
explain that by saying that a full cup of wine symbolizes complete joy and happiness. And even though we, the Jewish people, were happy that we were saved from our enemy and God visited judgment upon them, our joy isn't complete, because in order to save us, God had to kill the Egyptians. So what do we do each time we mention one of the plagues? We pour out a little wine. This is another way to deal with the sensitivity that you have shown and the rabbis have shown. Even though it was necessary for other people to suffer in order for us to be free and to win our liberation and to justify God in the world, we do not rejoice in the human suffering of others. Okay? So your feeling is legitimate. Your question is legitimate. God sorrows or grieves whenever it is required for any of his children, human beings, to die. But sometimes in the course of human history and because of our acts, it will happen. And sometimes, especially when it happens to the wicked, satisfaction over the punishment of the wicked is legitimate, even though we shouldn't revel in it. Lori, go ahead.
So God didn't want the angels to take sides.
He basically said, you have no skin in the game. The Egyptians never hurt you. These are my creatures. You're not human beings. You know, this is that the only people who have a right to feel any kind of a sense of relief and joy at their vindication and joy at their enemies paying the price are the people who suffered. You haven't got the right to do it. Now, Lori, let me talk about Rabbi Sachs's point, okay? If you read the Rabbi Sachs article, Rabbi Sachs was trying to show that what we think is a miracle could be easily explained in another way. And I'm going to turn to that, and then I've got one more point to make tonight. If you read Rabbi Sachs's article, he says, you know, it's really not such a miracle if you think about it. The Red Sea, especially at different times and in different conditions, is not that big a sea to cross. If I saw the Mississippi split, that would be a big deal. Heck, if I saw a lot of things split, it would be a big deal. It doesn't have to be the Mississippi. It could be a river as small in size as the Hudson River. I've been in New York on the Hudson River. If I saw the Hudson River split, which is much smaller than the Mississippi River across, I'd be absolutely flabbergasted. Some of you went with me to Israel and you saw the Jordan River. And some of you thought, this is the Jordan River that they crossed? I could cross this, no problem at all. Depending upon how big the river, the crossing isn't really necessarily all that miraculous. So what makes the crossing of the Red Sea so spectacular? Well, here's the answer, and Rabbi Sachs suggests it. The Red Sea is normally a body of water, and it's not a tremendously large river, but for 2.5 million people, including a lot of babies and a lot of whatchamacallit, it's a hard river to go across. And I don't think they had swimming lessons in those days. So I doubt if the people of Israel were really able to swim across, even if they could make the distance, and they probably could. They weren't swimmers. The amazing thing about the Red Sea is at certain times, especially when there is a strong east wind coming in from the east, which was that day, we know it because it's in the text. It causes the waters to divide. You want to create the Red Sea effect, take your morning coffee, okay? And across the top of your coffee, blow upon it. What do you see when you blow upon your coffee? What happens to the coffee, right? All right. What it does is when you blow on the coffee, you create a tunnel of air, which doesn't really force the waters to split, quite honestly. It just drives back the waters a little bit. Understanding that the Red Sea is not all that deep, if at just the right moment, a powerful east wind comes up and draws back the water a little, it's not going to be dry. They're not, it says on dry land, it wasn't dry land. It's going to be muddy and it's going to be sloshy. And if you were wearing boots or sandals, you're going to get a lot of mud in your boots. But guess what? You could probably walk across it easily enough. People could walk across it. But now you take a chariot or you take a man on a horse and you throw them into the midst of the Red Sea. And what did you say, Lori? They get stuck in the what? In the mud, right? Like a dinosaur in the La Brea tar pits.
In the mud.
All right. Suddenly, Pharaoh's advantage, Lori said, became his disadvantage. People on foot might be able to negotiate a crossing if they had sufficient time and the wind persisted to allow them to make the crossing, which wasn't very great anyway. But by the time Pharaoh's armies approached them, the people were essentially on the other side. And just as his heavy armor, his chariots and his horsemen were coming across, the wind dies down and the waters return. What's going to happen? The very advantage that they had becomes their disadvantage. Seen from the perspective of Israel, it was their relative weakness and the lack of military might that enabled their crossing. And it was Pharaoh's arrogance, his impudence, his hubris, his pride that caused Egyptians to suffer and to drown. Isn't that poetic? Okay. The very advantage that the Egyptian army had in chasing the Hebrews becomes the mechanism for their self-destruction. And when Pharaoh's chariots and his horsemen enter and they suddenly find the waters turning on them and their chariot wheels, as you should see the text, their chariot wheels get caught in the mud. The horses can't get out of the water. And you've seen these in battles too. Disaster comes. I'm a great student of battles. I fight ancient battles. And by the way, if you like, there's a whole section on YouTube called Great Battles, where you can fight all the great battles of history. I've been to Agincourt with Henry V against the French. I've been to this battlefield and that battlefield. And sometimes, you know what makes a difference? Weather. Weather. Why did Napoleon lose a certain battle or win a certain battle? Because earlier there had been rain that changed the field of battle and that gave the advantage to one side or another. Sometimes it's not the strength of an army. Sometimes it's merely the fact that it rained too long on the night before a big battle and it changed the outcome of the battle. Now, if you believe that these things aren't haphazard, then the real miracle is that just precisely at the moment when the Jewish people were cut off from safety and Pharaoh's army was approaching from the rear, suddenly this east wind blows and the waters seem to open a little and they see that land bar there, that muddy land bar. And they go. And miraculously, Moses stands there to encourage them, keep going, keep going, keep going. And they pass through. And then at that critical moment, when they finally reach the other side, and we were told that there was a climactic condition, a cloud that separated the camp of Israel from the camp of Egypt. Just coincidentally, that cloud dissipates. The Egyptians who've been held at bay now start to come through and the waters close on them. Miracle? Maybe. Supernatural? No. Nothing supernatural here, except for the fact that it happened precisely at the moment it had to happen in order for the Jewish people to be saved. Now that brings me to my last question for the evening. I have been assuming all along that the story of the Red Sea and the story that we will tell next week, the story of the desert, is designed to teach a lesson. We have talked about the lesson that Pharaoh learns, the lessons that the Egyptians learned, the lessons that we learn in history. But right now, I'm just interested in one audience. I am interested in the audience called the Jewish people. Because after all, this is going to be the prime story in our tradition. If we tell this story day after day, every day of the week, at least 2 or 3 times a day, it must be an important story. So my last question to you is this. What does the lesson of the sea, what does the story of the sea, what is it meant to teach the Jewish people? And by extension, the story of the desert we are about to come to next week. Both the story of the sea and the story of the desert are both meant to teach 2 great truths to the Jewish people. What truths are they designed to teach? Neil, go ahead. I see your hand.
To underscore the covenant.
Hmm?
To underscore the covenant.
All right, but the covenant hasn't been made yet. Yes, it will underscore, yes, when the time comes when God enters into the covenant at Sinai, it will serve as a basis of the covenant. But before they even get to Sinai, what 2 lessons was the story of the sea and the story of the desert designed to teach the Jewish people? There are 2 lessons that the Jewish people have to learn, and they will learn it over a period of 40 years. What 2 lessons do the Jewish people have to learn? Hal, go ahead.
A couple. I'll just throw out a couple. One, belief and trust in God.
Good. Stop there for a second, Hal. Okay, stop there. Okay. Belief and trust in God. The story of the sea and the story of the desert are designed to instill in the Jewish people faith in God. Not even belief. It's not a it's not a theological proposition. It's not, oh, now I philosophically believe in God. Trust in God. If I'm going to commit myself to this God, I got to have trust in him. So number 1, Hal says, the story of the sea and the story of the desert to come are to instill in God's people, even before they come to Mount Sinai, the idea of trust in God. Okay, Hal, I cut you off. I'm sorry. You said trust in God.
Brought a second one, and that is, with freedom comes responsibility, because there's a quote in the text that says, miracles do not last, only the daily triumph over adversity continues or stays.
Okay, absolutely correct. Trust in God and trust in ourselves. This is the great lesson of the Torah. God wants us to have faith in God, but belief in ourselves. One without the other is incomplete. If I leave everything to God, if I say, God will do it, I don't have to worry, I don't have any responsibilities, I'm going to wait for God to deliver a miracle and everything is going to be great. That's not the attitude you want to adopt, okay? Faith in God is necessary, but it is a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition. I'm sorry, it's necessary, but it doesn't stand on its own. Complementing faith in God, that God will be with us, is the recognition that we have to act on our own behalf. If we do not believe in ourselves, if we constantly are turning to God to pluck us out of difficult situations and save us at the critical moment, and we do not realize that God has given us the tools, sometimes all we need to do is think and look and realize we will never be mature human beings. If I have faith in my Father, that he will always protect me and save me, that's a wonderful thing. But at some point along the way, if I'm a normal, developed human being, I have to begin to develop faith in my own abilities too. I can't always rely on my Father being there, or even if he is always there, I can't always rely upon him to meet a challenge that really isn't even his challenge, it's my challenge. Next week, we're going to see that as we're coming back to the sea, but then we're going into the desert. And I'm going to ask you the following question. You have just read the episode at the Red Sea, okay? You have read the episode at the Red Sea. I'm going to read you a little midrash now. I want you to think about it, and then we'll talk about it next week. Here's the story. Moses and the Jewish people stood at the Red Sea, which formed for them a barrier that they could not cross. Up they looked backward and saw the forces of Pharaoh pursuing him, his 600 chariots and their horsemen. The people began to grumble. Moses, why did you bring us out of the land of Egypt? It would have been better for us to remain slaves in the land. At least we would have lived. But now we and our wives and our children will all die here. Moses tries to quiet the people, but they refuse to be quieted, and each suggests an appropriate response. One man named Datan said, Moses, there is no way out. The sea is in front of us and the Egyptian army is on our tail. On the other two sides of us, there is only wilderness filled with wild beasts and ways we do not know. The only answer, Moses said, Datan, is to try and secure a peace agreement with Pharaoh, and maybe he will let us live and we can return to Egypt. So we can't fight this, we can't escape it. The only answer, Moses, is we have to sue for the best terms we can, and maybe those of us who survive can live again as slaves in Egypt. Ridiculous, claimed another man called Aviram. After all the plagues that have befallen us, after all the promises that Pharaoh made to us that he would release us, even if he agreed to spare us and agreed to allow us to return to Egypt in safety, we have no guarantee that he will not turn on us again with his swords and spears and slay us all. Never, never shall we allow this. Let us take up our arms and fight ourselves against Pharaoh, and if we die, we die. Yossi, who is a non-historical character, turned and said, it's useless to fight. We will be killed in battle. Our people are not fighters, and we have no weapons that we have brought with us. After all, the miracles that were done to us for us in Egypt were all done by God. It makes no sense to try and fight, we will lose. It makes no sense to try and return to Pharaoh because he will not have mercy on us at any rate. And even if he spares some of us, it will only be for degradation and horror. Let us run into the sea and drown ourselves. Let us all die, the Masada answer. Better to die at our own hand than to suffer at the hands of our enemies. And if the sea is not to your liking, then let us turn into the wilderness and let wild animals devour us. After hearing all of this, Moses said, no, we must declare a day of prayer, and we must turn to God and we must pray that he deliver us. And if you look at the text, Moses calls upon God. And what does God say? God's response was swift and unequivocal. What are you waiting for? Now is not the time to pray. Just walk into the sea and trust me. Okay. All right, we're going to look at that passage again next week, but it's a brilliant passage. It's a brilliant passage, okay? Against insurmountable odds, we try and take what precautions we can. That's human nature. But in the end, sometime we have to trust in God, and we have to go ahead and we have to do what God wants us to do. It is a time to act in the belief that if we do what God wants, God will protect us. This is a great lesson of Jewish history. We will come back to this next week as we look at the story in greater detail, and we will then continue the story next week as we come to the story of the desert, where in episode after episode, as people have said, we seem to falter, we seem to forget the lesson, and God tries to reintroduce it time after time. It seems as if, like in the building of the golden calf, after a few days, we forget the miracles, we lose our faith, we lose our ability to trust, and we go right back to saying, God, what are you going to do for us? How are you going to save us? The Jewish people have to learn how to trust in God, but how to live life as free, responsible, moral human beings. This is the great lesson of the story of the sea and of the desert. Okay. With that, any final comments? Go ahead, Gail.
I also found great symbolism in the sea itself and the water, because it represents life, and it was and death to the Egyptians, but life to people who crossed the water, and water being that symbol, having that symbolism, meant that they were like being reborn as a new people, not slaves anymore, but a nation.
Very good, Gail. Water is always a symbol of life and death, or what we call it, death and rebirth. The ritual in Judaism is when a woman, after a certain period, goes to the mikvah, she marks the end of one period of her life sexually, which is the period of her menstrual cycle, and the rebirth of new possibilities of birth. Immersion in Judaism, which had its counterpart later in the story of Christianity and what is called baptism, always represents death and new life. To cross a body of water means a part of your past life has died and a new part of your life has begun. The Red Sea represents the boundary between slavery and adulthood, between dependence and independence, or at least self-dependence, okay? The sea is a powerful symbol. Rivers and deserts are always powerful symbols. They are always what are called liminal symbols. Go ahead, Gail.
One more thing is that, and I read this somewhere, that water is often a metaphor for the Torah.
Yes.
So I found that also very symbolic, since we're going to receive the Torah shortly.
Interestingly enough, their Torah is compared to two symbols that you're going to see prominently in all the rest of the stories from this point on. Torah is symbolized by water, and Torah is also symbol, and I'll talk about this. We will talk about this. Just as water is a source of life, Torah is a source of life, right? Just as water has the power to purify, Torah has the power to purify. You know what the other symbol is, the opposite of water on the elemental chart? Fire. And boy, when you come to Sinai, you're going to see it. Simultaneously, the Torah is two opposite symbols at one and the same time. It is water and fire, okay? We'll talk about it, we'll talk. But interestingly enough, these two basic symbols, water and fire, are the major ways in which Torah is described. And in the experience that we see of Israel, they're without water, they go through days, there's no water, this, that, and the other, in their experience of Sinai, water and fire will be the vehicles through which God will test them and will show them the truth of Torah, even before they stand at Mount Sinai to receive it. Okay, good, Gail. All right, everybody, deep stuff, deep stuff. And I know that, you know, Cecil B. DeMille, you can watch and be amazed, but this stuff is deeper than DeMille. This stuff is really, really good. And believe it or not, with all we have said tonight, we barely touched the surface because there was so much other imagery. That's why I chose this material rather than other material that Sachs had. I wanted to go in a different way than what was in Rabbi Sachs's other books. So all this material that we're studying is for a new insight into the deeper meaning. And I hope, by the way, that some of you have asked in the past, well, Rabbi, what does this have? What relevance does this have for us today? It has absolute relevance. The idea that through going through life is tough, that life is hard, and those who make it have learned both trust in God and trust in their own strength and ability to surmount challenges. That's a lesson which, if you learned it early enough in life, will take you through a lot of hard times. We have to believe in God. We have to know that at the end of the day, we can do everything right, and ultimately we're always in God's hands, but we have to have belief in ourselves as well. And that's the lesson of tonight's story. Cal?
One last quick point. I found the whole debate, Rabbi Sachs and others, about natural tide pools were hugely boring. I read the legend and the miracle and forget the National Geographic, Bill the Science Guy approach to all of this. I mean, and then for 2 million people to cross the Red Sea, that, you know, the tide pools went up, they went down. You know, print a miracle, as somebody once said.
Yeah, the Bill Nye version. Here's the difference. Our ancestors would never have explained it this way, Hal. We live in what is called a mechanistic age. We understand the universe is working according to certain processes and laws and procedures. That's a very mechanistic view of the universe. Our ancestors saw miracles everywhere. Now, I don't know if you can capture that, but if you can come to an understanding of biblical man. Biblical man didn't have sophisticated answers. They certainly didn't have, for the 9 plagues, they couldn't explain it or say. And Hal found it boring. You know, I wouldn't say I found it boring, but for mechanistic explanations, for people who need a mechanistic explanation, all right, I prefer to be amazed. I prefer to find it miraculous that just at the time, however it occurred, these things occurred to save a people. An improbable end to the story of a people who it's improbable. And it was miraculous, even if it happened through natural means. So there you go, Hal. When the next National Geographic comes on, just ignore it. Don't watch it. They'll tell you how everything occurred. It all started with an earthquake or a volcano. They'll tell you all that. Don't bother with it. Go back to your Taurus. All right, everybody. Good night. Good evening.
Thank you, Rabbi.
You're
Thank you,
welcome.
Rabbi.
You're welcome.
And thank you for your
Thank
phone call.
you.
Oh, my pleasure.
Sorry,
Thank
we
you all.
weren't able to get back to you, but thank you for your phone call.
Oh, you're welcome.
You're still recording, Rabbi.
Oh, thank you,
sorry.
Cantor. We're going to turn off the recording right now. Thank you.
Rabbi, I was gonna say,
Yes.
but then we